Greetings, Columbia. I'm Adam Brown, and I'm Program Director of Solaire, Science of Learning Research Initiative here at Columbia. If you attended our panel last year, you heard a little bit about Solaire and heard about some of the projects that we've been working on. And I'm here today to present you with an update on how our thinking in Solaire has developed over the last year. And the main thing that's developed is that we've branched out. And by that, I mean that we've taken some time to think about this broad thing called the science of learning. And we determined that a really useful way of thinking about it is to think of three interrelated branches within that umbrella. And I'm going to tell you about one of those branches in detail on my own today. And then the other two branches, we're going to hear from some of our Solaire affiliates about in two panels. So our theme today is enhancing the scholarship of teaching and learning through learning analytics and applied learning sciences. And take a moment to take a look at our list of panelists here today. I'll introduce them in detail a little bit later, but for now, just notice how we have a great range of types of Columbia community members represented here. We have tenure track faculty, non-tenure track faculty, non-faculty staff, and graduate students all represented. So this is part of understanding the community that Solaire is creating. To understand Solaire, we have to go back to 2014, when the Provost Faculty Committee on Educational Innovation recommended the creation of two offices centrally within the university. One, the Center for Teaching and Learning, which you all know all about. It was created in 2015, converted from a precursor organization that had been around since the 90s with a focus on educational technology. But the report also recommended the creation of a research center devoted to building capacity in the learning sciences. So to complement all the amazing work that the CTL does with an organization specifically focused on research as it pertains to teaching and learning. And that ultimately became Solaire, the Science of Learning Research Initiative, which was established in 2018 and became fully operational in 2020. The report explained that teaching itself should become an object of research, ideally in collaboration with learning scientists and educational researchers. So here we are beginning to see this idea of collaboration between faculty and others around campus who have expertise in teaching and learning, and what kinds of projects and interesting research can be developed from those collaborations. So Solaire was meant to be a hub for cross-disciplinary research on teaching and learning in higher education under the office, what's now called the Office of Teaching, Learning, and Innovation, OTLI, and next to the CTL. So highlighting those three terms there to explain that Solaire really exists at the intersection of research, teaching and learning, and higher education administration. And as I mentioned, we've been thinking about this idea of branching out, recognizing three different sub-branches within the science of learning. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about these three, and we're going to hear about two of them in depth from our panelists today. So the first of these is SoTL Research, then learning analytics, then applied learning sciences. So with these three branches, Solaire uses a scientific lens to understand and improve the experiences of students and instructors, all while building the science of learning community. So I'll tell you a little bit about each of these just to get us started. The first, the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, or SoTL Research. So what is it? It's empowering faculty to conduct teaching and learning experiments in their own classrooms. And why should faculty engage in this work? Why would Solaire prioritize it? Because rigorous studies that provide strong evidence about best practices in teaching and learning contribute to our broader understanding of how learning works in different disciplinary contexts in higher ed. And the main way that Solaire supports this is through funding and in-kind support through the mechanism of Solaire grants. So faculty apply for grants, and we support them in the development of these projects, the collection of data, presentation of data, et cetera. So faculty are doing experiments in their own classrooms, approaching it from a scientific perspective. That is the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, or SoTL Research. The second branch, learning analytics. This is when we are extracting insights from academic and institutional data streams. So this can happen at the level of an individual course or across a whole degree program, or even the entire institution. And it's kind of the big data science approach. So zooming out a little bit and looking for patterns. What kind of patterns? Well, we might learn something about student behaviors, how that relates to different outcomes in courses and degree programs. It can also help us understand and make better decisions about academic technology policies. And how does Solaire support learning analytics? By combining our understanding of pedagogy with the technical skills and the understanding of statistics, putting all of that together. And then in our third branch, the applied learning sciences, in this case, we are starting with researchers who, as their primary scholarly activity, their primary research focus, study teaching and learning, for example, in the psychology department, and then taking those ideas and connecting them to Columbia University courses so that they can be tested in context. So by translating theory into practice, we're able to center the experiences of Columbia teachers and learners. And Solaire facilitates those connections, right? Connecting between the sort of laboratory science perspective of a learning scientist and the applied context of studying what happens when those ideas are tested in a classroom. And as I mentioned, we're going to hear all about learning analytics and applied learning sciences from our panelists today. Before we do, I'm going to go a little bit more in depth about SoTL Research, because this is kind of the classic model of Solaire's work, and it's most of what we've done over the past few years. As I mentioned, all of this together is part of the process of building the science of learning community. Since Solaire is centralized in the office of the provost, we have a unique position that allows us to foster collaborations and conversations, to advocate for and boost the visibility of our affiliates, to train the next generation of scholars by recruiting graduate student assistants, and crucially, we're able to connect our work to the broader academic world, be part of a conversation across higher ed. And just want to give a special thanks to our 3 graduate student assistants. We have 1 PhD student and 2 master's students who have been doing amazing work with us recently, and I want to make sure that we recognize them for their contributions. As I mentioned, I'm going to tell you a little bit more in depth about SoTL Research before we transition to our panel. So this slide here is an example of how I communicate to departments about Solaire when I am informing them about the overall idea of SoTL Research and our Solaire grants program in particular. So when I talk to faculty, I said that Solaire empowers faculty to conduct experiments about their teaching and their students' learning. And as I suggested on the previous slide, we do this because this is the scholarship of teaching and learning, specifically the research approach to that broad idea. And when we engage in these kinds of rigorous studies that are grounded in theory, it provides very strong evidence about best practices. It contributes to our broader understanding, and it's an exciting and unique opportunity to reimagine education and pioneer new approaches. And how do we do this? As I mentioned, through this grant program called the Provost Solaire Seed Grants, or PSSG. This year, the proposals are due May 1st, and these grants provide faculty with funding and a lot of in-kind support. So because we are aiming to facilitate the process of research, which is a challenging process, we support that process at every level. So refining the research objectives and designs, identifying or developing new assessments, navigating the institutional review board approval process, and then actually collecting, analyzing data, and reporting, composing manuscripts and presentations. So we support that whole process from beginning to end. Here is an example of one project, which you may remember if you attended the panel last year. Professor Brent Stockwell, who's now the chair of biological sciences, studied the use of virtual reality for teaching introductory biochemistry. This was a project that happened in collaboration with CUIT's Emerging Technologies Consortium. So in this project, it originated during the deep, dark days of COVID when everything was remote. And we recruited students to participate in small group sessions as part of their intro biochem course, either in VR or on Zoom, and then in a later iteration of the course, once things were back on campus in person. And in any of these 3 contexts, students were meeting with the TA in a group. They were examining visuals and models related to the curriculum, and they engaged in discussion and group work. And at the end of the semester, we gave all the students an assessment in which they completed a quiz, which asked questions related to the 3D and spatial understanding that we hypothesized might be enhanced by interacting with these 3D objects. And you can see in the GIF on the lower right there what that virtual environment looked like. You can see that the students in the VR group were interacting with these 3D models of proteins that they could rotate and scale and examine. So they completed that quiz at the end, and then also a survey which asked about their feelings of engagement, motivation, and confidence. And what we found is that the VR experience enhanced their engagement, and at the very least, we can say it did not interfere with their learning. So there was no deficit in learning associated with being in VR. And perhaps in future, as we continue to develop this idea further, we'll be able to discover ways that these experiences can enhance the learning as well. And we're now studying the use of augmented reality, in which you are adding an additional layer of virtual experience, interacting with digital objects while still being engaged with the physical environment around you. So you're not in a separate virtual space, but adding the ability to interact with virtual objects on top of your normal experience in a room with other people. I want to point out that this project takes place in the sciences, but Solaire's work, this kind of SoTL research, it can apply in any disciplinary context, because really what we're doing is simply using a scientific approach to address questions about the learning process. And that applies equally well in any disciplinary context. Also notice that this project was very high tech, but Solaire projects can be anywhere on that continuum from high to low tech. It could be about an instructional approach that's decidedly low tech rather than something like this. And also the questions that are addressed can be anywhere on the continuum from discipline specific to general. In this project, this example here is an interesting case because the questions we were asking were both discipline specific, related to the specific learning objectives about the 3D understanding of protein structures, as well as more general questions about what being in a virtual environment is like and how that affected students' feelings of belonging or connection to their classmates. So those are questions that might be asked in other disciplinary contexts just as well. So a mix of both discipline specific and more discipline general thinking in this project. So if you're interested in applying for one of these grants or learning more about the program, you can email solaire@columbia.edu to set up a consultation, or check out our website, solaire.columbia.edu. And also we're going to drop in the chat a link to an upcoming info session coming up in 2 weeks, where you can get the chance to ask questions about these grants. But in any case, we're now going to continue to talk more about the other two branches of Solaire. And I want to be clear that these branches are not mutually exclusive. So the projects that you're going to hear about in the rest of the panel today were also recipients of these Solaire grants, but they put a little bit different spin, a little bit different approach, different goals and perspectives on these projects, which maybe it's helpful, therefore, to think of them as a slightly different category. So our first panel presentation will be from Samantha Garbers and Roxanne Russell from the Mailman School of Public Health. Dr. Samantha Garbers is Associate Professor of Population and Family Health at Mailman, and Dr. Roxanne Russell is the Director of Online Education at Mailman. And they will tell you about their project and how it illustrates the learning analytics branch of Solaire's work.
Great, thanks, glad to be here. It's okay, I'm gonna just start sharing my screen, share my slides, and talk a little bit about the work that we've done. So Roxanne Russell and I are here. I'm Associate Professor in the School of Public Health in the Heilbronn Department of Population and Family Health. Roxanne, you want to do a quick intro for yourself too?
Sure, I'll introduce my new title, which is Assistant Dean of Digital Learning for the Mailman School of Public Health.
Great. And just to put our work in the sort of taxonomy that Adam Brown just presented of where this fits in with the science of teaching and learning, our work is involved certainly in the systematic examination of learning processes that happen in the courses that we teach or that we support. Our work is really looking at rigorously testing ways to improve the learning experiences and learning outcomes for our students, to facilitate inclusive learning environments, which is becoming increasingly a focus, responding effectively to the sort of changing educational needs and contexts, the pandemic being not the least of them. But the fact is that in order to make evidence-based decision-making, we do need data. And so our talk today is going to focus on learning analytics. And by that, I mean mining existing data that are generated when students engage with the course elements on the digital platform. So in the case of Columbia, this is the courseworks, the back end is called Canvas. And these learning analytics reveal to us patterns that give us insights on students' learning behaviors, their attitudes, and their experiences. As a faculty person, I would just like to say that engagement is really, really important, right? Students and faculty are seeking opportunities for students to engage in critical thinking. And engagement is broadly defined as the investment of time, energy, and resources in course content. But Dr. Russell and I are really focused specifically in our work on behavioral engagement, which is observable actions that represent investment in learning. So that means attending physically or online, going to class, coming to class prepared, that is having done the prep work, which can include watching videos or doing readings. And there's a pretty dense body of evidence that shows that engagement correlates with lots of really important outcomes, not just student satisfaction, but also improved course persistence, student success as measured by grades and completing degrees, and then actually after their time in school is occupational attainment. But the fact is, in the course where Dr. Russell and I collaborate, engagement can be really challenging. So one of the areas of focus with our Solaire funded research has been in the interdisciplinary core curriculum in the School of Public Health. This is a foundational course that is integrated and interdisciplinary across all 6 departments of the school. Students spend a full semester taking 6 courses that are called studios with 16 concentrations nested in them. It's a complex course, as you can see. We're not going to walk you through that diagram, but you can see it's a complex course. And it's taught in a traditional format, but also in a hybrid format, or what's more commonly called sometimes a flipped classroom. So what we have learned in carrying out these courses, both traditional format and hybrid, is that we can't assume that if you build it, they will come. We develop syllabi with readings. We work to develop brief, engaging videos. But we don't necessarily find that students are always engaging with our work. And yet that engagement is essential to sort of get the most out of the course. So Roxanne, if it's okay with you, can I hand it over to you to sort of talk a little bit more about learning analytics?
Sure. Are you gonna? Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Adam got us started, and Sam added on to that about learning analytics. So I won't redefine it. I think we all have a sense of what that is, but maybe a few use cases would be helpful, just thinking about how it's used across higher ed. So I think some of the most common uses are at an institutional level. Folks have looked at, especially at state schools, the improving student retention. This is where they look at DFW rates, which students are getting D's and F's and which students are withdraw. And then they can see dramatic improvements with some intervention, like sending a welcome email. They'll all of a sudden see a 40% decrease in dropout rates just from this small intervention. And that was something that was powerful about learning analytics early on. But in environments, and this is the second environment that I've been in, before it was Emory and now at Columbia, where you have a really different set of students. So you have a tendency to have grades where the differences might be between 90 and 95 rather than the difference between failing and passing. And you start to get into a much more nuanced look at how learning analytics can help inform the learning experience for students and communicate more complex concepts to the faculty about what's happening in their classes and with their students, but learning behaviors. So that was the most exciting part about working with Dr. Garbers on this, is that she had ideas about how to use these analytics in new and nuanced ways for understanding their learning behaviors and for being able to provide timely feedback and intervention within her class. So the types of learning analytics and the type of information we looked at within Canvas, actually came from a few different sources. So you've got looking at readings, and so far right now, we can know one thing, which is that they at least clicked on the reading, right? We don't know if they finished it. We know they clicked through. Well, we also know they don't click through a lot. So all of that suspicion of the students aren't doing the readings, it turns out that's true. If you look at the learning analytics, a lot of students are not doing the readings. Most students do click on slide decks, for example. We get a lot of good data there with the learning analytics. With videos, you get more complete information. You can have information about the percentage of completion. And I wish we could have that for readings as well. But for videos, we get that. And you can also get hotspots, like, for example, where students tend to rewind and look at again, or where you've got drop-offs. So that's particularly rich information. In the Melvin School of Public Health, and within this core curriculum that Sam told you about, we use these RISE interactive modules from Articulate RISE or Articulate 360. And that you could do either or, depending on how you set it up. You can just know if they click through to it, or you can have a completion rate on those, depending on how you have it feed into the system. Discussion boards are probably one of the most rich spaces for finding out information about student engagement and behaviors. For some classes, in particular, social network analysis is a really exciting space for learning analytics, but we haven't used that here. And then learning checks, we used in a way both for performance and looking at what type of preparation is done in association with a learning check. So did they go back and look at slides, or did they look at information that was provided specifically for quizzes or learning checks? Mm-hmm. And so from this, just as to sum it up, the things you can learn from learning analytics, you can get formative information. As you're going along through the semester, you can find out whether and when they are accessing course materials. As many of you know, I think in here, and probably help faculty use the tools that are already built into Canvas, where you can say somebody's missing an assignment. You can nudge them with the tool that's built in. And you can find out if there are students who are struggling and not completing work, and be able to address that earlier before it's too late. But in a summative sense, you can take a look back for design purposes and really thinking about what's going to happen next time. It makes for a much richer debrief of what happened in the class. And then in the case of Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, you can look at the effect of what you might have tried as an intervention in that class, or it can help you design an intervention for a future class. So we did a very deep dive across our entire core 2 years ago, or it's coming up on 2 years ago, using how our course elements, first we mapped everything, the alignment of what was happening in the course from learning activities through assessments, and what the learning objectives were, mapped everything that was happening in the course, then downloaded data from Canvas, from Panopto, about the Zoom attendance during when everyone was home for the pandemic. And that was a lot of work to clean that up. And then looked at what were the student outcomes. So we had performance, behavior, and with course evaluations, their attitudes about what was happening in the class, to really think through as we were preparing our core to go online. We used all of this really deep information to prepare for that. And it also highlighted things that Dr. Garbers and I wanted to focus on for her core course, both in person and online.
Great. So learning analytics can tell us a lot, but they're not necessarily a cure-all. So this slide, I just wanted to sort of talk through some of the limitations of learning analytics and what methods we've employed to sort of enhance their utility for the SoTL work that we're doing. So Dr. Russell's referred to this. There are some learning outcomes that we care about that are not necessarily housed within the course. So assessment grades are one learning outcome, but they don't necessarily follow through in a deeper way that we want to look at. So Our work has included merging with other data sources with IRB permission. So looking at things like metacognition, course evaluations around perceived critical thinking. We can also look at graduate surveys, the extent to which students feel like they're able to perform the competencies that the course is mapped to, and even we could look at things like employment outcomes. What it can tell us about are social learning strategies. So in our current Solaire funded work, we're actually doing some mixed methods work that really look at how students engage with material. What we're really learning about are the social learning strategies that students engage in, particularly in a complicated course like the core. And so the importance of collecting qualitative data really can fill this gap for us. Dr. Russell mentioned this for some material, for instance, readings. The learning analytics can tell us whether students engage with the materials, yes, no, meaning did they access it, yes, no. We can't get, aside from videos, we can't always get good sort of dose response data. And we have also learned to use extreme caution because while the LMS tracks data such as cumulative time spent, that is not necessarily a measure of how much time is actively spent engaging with materials. So we're using some qualitative data with that, and the hope is that the sort of LMS backend sort of gets up to speed in some of those metrics. And then finally, I just want to say how important the work that the online learning, the digital learning studios work has done, sort of in that previous slide, the work of mapping this course. The learning analytics that the LMS houses is a giant warehouse of data, which, as we mentioned on the previous slide, have to be manually combed through and cleaned and coded. And so the important step of mapping the elements of the course with the back-end learning analytics, bringing together the research team and the teaching team is a critical step. So just before we wrap up, I don't know, Roxanne, whether you want to sort of talk about this. I would really like to continue to work with Solaire and my colleagues to make working with learning analytics more user-friendly. And I know, Roxanne, I'll hand it over to you because I know you've done more work in terms of team building around this.
Thank you. I'll just quickly say that Adam Brown, who opened us up and is hosting this session, and the Provost office and CUIT, we all came together. A lot of people on this call, I think, are part of the Academic Technology Learning Group. We were a subcommittee of that group and came together and spent a significant amount of time working through what are the challenges and barriers and what are our desires and needs for an academic reporting environment, which is where is a place where we could go and do a little bit easier sorting and filtering of the current reports that are available. And how could we bring together a space that could be used across all of the campuses? We are still working through that challenge, but this type of work is the type of work that we'd like to see go on more and more. The type of work that's where you use learning analytics to solve these problems could get easier and could become more ubiquitous if we had access to a user-friendly academic reporting environment.
Right. I agree. Hear, hear. Thanks. We're looking forward to hearing from our colleagues on the panel. Thanks for including us.
Thanks so much, Dr. Garbers and Dr. Russell. We're going to move on now to our second and final pair of panelists. We have Dr. Tugce Bilgin, who is a lecturer in the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Environmental Biology and a Columbia Science Fellow. And we have Josh Friedman, who is a PhD candidate in the Cognitive Science in Education program at Teachers College.
Hi there. Welcome everyone. Josh is gonna share our slides and I'm gonna begin once we can all see the slides. I see that we can all see it. So I am an instructor in Frontiers of Science. This is a core course required for all the students who are joining from many different majors. And we generally teach about frontiering topics in science, which are very excited, like black holes or brain research, or pressing issues like climate change and, for example, genomics or mutations of coronavirus. And we try to give our students the equipment for them to understand science, like analytical thinking, critical thinking, literature review, and understanding of stats and probability. And while doing that, of course, we are a big team. You can see a picture of the team from previous semester. We are about 20 instructors, a little bit less maybe, depending on the semester, each of us teaching 2 sections each. And we all have about 650 students per semester. But at the end of the day, we have small class sizes because we are so many. And this allows us to do hands-on activities, like this is a black hole activity, or discussions. And this way we can connect to our students in many different ways and at a more personal level, I would say. Well, for me personally, why I got interested or got so passionate about pedagogy research, I think began like very solidly when we had no connections. Of course, during the pandemic time, it was so hard to connect to our students. I especially began to get interested, how can we enhance student-student connections at the time, like how to build communities, how to create a feeling of belonging among students. With my fellow instructors, we got a CTL grant to work on this also. So this was the moment when Adam and Josh came to me and suggested, oh, why don't we work on a project that will investigate teacher-student connections and its role in learning. So Josh will take it from here.
Thank you, Tugce. So I started my fascination with how people learn and the connections that occur during learning interactions at summer camp. I was privileged enough to have the experience growing up of learning not just in nature or in the environment, but from people that were in a far more informal space and attitude than that I experienced in public school. And it made me sort of curious over a long period of time, because I didn't have the greatest experience in public school. What was missing from there? Why I was learning so many more things at this sort of informal, non-educational environment, and having such a rough time finding value in the educational or formal environment. And so I wondered really how each piece was, or how each environment was missing from the other. And I thought, reasoned on that it was something about how people work. And this eventually led to a series of projects collecting data at a summer camp and at an after-school program that led to my PhD applications. Specifically, I was just fascinated by, there was one counterexample at the public school where this is not her, but my senior English teacher, just as a representative sort of look, this is what the room looked like in Mrs. J's classroom. And she was regularly walking up and down the middle of the room, making eye contact with us, smiling, a little twinkle in her eye when we got something that she wanted to acknowledge, and sort of glaring at us in the friendliest glare you can imagine when we were falling short of her expectations. And all of it felt engaging and interesting and intriguing, and it made the heavy amount of content that we were learning in this, senior English AP class that much more friendly, that much more interesting, and felt broader, like there was more space for me to engage with it. And so I started trying to investigate this. How do we think in terms of others? How did the English I learned from Miss J differ from the English I learned from Miss Lopez or any other teacher that came before her? And so I started asking people, tell me about your favorite teacher, your least favorite teacher, and what you learned from them. And this is sort of really challenging, right? Retrospective data, not so easy to draw conclusions from or to know really what we're looking at. In-person observational studies, though, that are done in the classroom and have these intensive qualitative styles of looking at the video and coding the video, repeatedly show that these connection variables, how much the teacher is interacting with the student, how they're interacting with the student, they matter and they affect grades, but they fail to really show how they affect that student and that student's learning over time. And so this is what I became deeply fascinated about. How does a connected teacher-student relationship, Miss J and I, emerge from something that was before disconnected? And how does this relate to the student's learning and engagement and development? And so, looking at the literature, there seems to be reason to believe that this matters. There is discussed even in the latest and greatest of neuroscientific research that when we're connected with people, we're able to sort of engage with them in this way that both of us are learning about the environment outside. And at the same time. This happens in social learning environments, in paired learning environments. When we're interacting with each other and that interaction is going well, we learn better as individuals. Whereas it seems when we don't really know each other, when we feel disconnected, we're actually just spending a lot of time trying to learn one another, but without focusing on the environment outside. And so I tried to ask myself, and this is most of what my work is involved in, is how can we sort of chart or plot the change process from this learning to dance to this dancing to learn moment? What does that mean really? It means that we look at teachers and we look at students and we look at how they interact. And if we consider the reality that the student is capable of, represented by this circle, we try to watch how a teacher before disconnected from the student enters into that student's reality and begins to share that reality, building a shared language. Oh, when you say this, you mean that. When I say this, I mean that. And how they then expand that student's reality from pointing out things in the outside world. And we're wondering, can we watch this process develop through what we call shared practices? For example, building that shared language, and eventually building what gets called in the literature shared coordination, but importantly is thought of as something like we have a shared memory and we have a shared goal. We're placing ourselves in that environment in space and time to understand it and the future as we grow. And so when we look at shared practices, we're looking at how our thoughts and actions aligned during the activity. And we're looking at shared coordination. We're asking, how do these lead to shared memories and shared goal systems? In this particular study, we looked at specifically how do the facial actions of teachers and students align or synchronize with each other over time, which is to say the muscles in my face and where my eyes or head is pointing. And if we randomly assign people to meet people they are familiar with or people they've never met, in other words, people they already have shared memories and shared goal systems with, or people they don't, how does that affect these shared practices and the learning that happens in that environment? So if we take a student and a teacher while they're interacting and we try to quantify or qualify these particular variables, we hypothesize that students who know their teacher from class, in other words, they met in Frontiers of Science, they spent the whole semester together, and we compare them to teachers and students randomly assigned to meet not their teacher from the semester, but another teacher from the 20 that taught the same course, so they have the same experience, but they've never met each other. We think that the people who know each other will perform better on content-related problems, such as in the case of Frontiers of Science, scientific reasoning tasks, and that they will dance to learn. Their performance will directly correlate with the synchrony of their facial actions with their teacher. Whereas in the case where I don't know you or you don't know me, our performance will actually indirectly correlate with the synchrony of our facial actions, because we'll be focusing on building that shared practice in the absence of shared coordination. So how did we manipulate familiarity? As I mentioned, we took Frontiers of Science instructor-student dyads who volunteered to be a part of the study from fall 2022. We randomly assigned them to either meet each other, the student that they had in class, the teacher that was their Frontiers of Science teacher, or to meet somebody from a different section, a student that had a different teacher or a teacher that had different students. And while what we did was we randomly assigned them to meet each other, and we invited them to participate in 2 scientific reasoning tasks on a custom-built online portal. In one task, they looked at chains of gears, and they were told the direction that the first gear turned and asked to reply with what direction the last gear would turn. Very mechanistic task. In the complex task, they were given more of a problem space, where they were given some sort of environment that either had a problem to test, to design an experiment in order to test, or they were given an experiment that was already designed to generate a hypothesis about, or they were given an experiment that was already conducted with data available and asked to interpret the data and the meaning of it. While they were doing these tasks, we were recording their video in the online portal. And what we did with that video is we put it through a machine learning algorithm that is like state of the art. And as you can see, plots points on the face for each of the parts of the face and the muscles. And each of these points moves as the muscles move. And from those movements, we get amplitude values of how much the face has moved that are time locked by both the task itself and the other participant, so that we can look at when your face moves, does my face move, and vice versa. So what did we find? Preliminarily, results from a pilot study that we did last summer with students from spring 2022 suggests that familiar dyads scored higher than unfamiliar dyads on both tasks, essentially across the board. During both reasoning tasks, there were opposite relationships between facial action synchrony and performance across the familiar and the unfamiliar dyads. However, we're currently investigating whether the full sample of 41 dyads from fall 2022 supports these conclusions or speaks against them. Overall, working alongside Frontiers in Science instructors truly provided invaluable insights for the study. As somebody that's interested in this work from an outside perspective, as somebody that has a history of experience in informal, but not so much formal education environments, it was absolutely necessary to have the grounded perspective that comes from people that are in that classroom and know how the students themselves learn. And so just as an example, we had various prompts in the task where the instructors are scripted to read the problem and provide feedback on the problem. And it all felt very robotic, but simply adding various little courtesies of thank you and thank you for your response made the interaction feel a lot more natural, while still being able to maintain control across instructors as much as we possibly could to be able to look at the effect on students. Additionally, originally, we had a hypothesis generation question that presented results in this slide. Essentially said how many students were in the monotony group and got scored for a low level of novelty on the stories they generated. And these are not the student participants, but rather the subjects in an experiment that the student participants are thinking about. And what this did was it required those student participants to have some background knowledge of, well, what does it mean to hear something novel or monotonous, and then psychologically create something as a result of it. And it was sort of set the bar really high for generating a hypothesis that was theoretically explanatory. And instructors pointed out, they're like, they're not psychology students. Like they are science students and they're learning science. But this is a step sort of beyond to be able to bring in background knowledge they don't have. And so by removing the results, we actually got them to sit from their point of knowledge and say, well, based on what I think about how people work, in other words, using some kind of conjecture, but background knowledge as I'm familiar with and the information you've provided, and only that information, adding control, they were able to engage with the task and say, well, if I heard a more monotonous story, I think I would have a lower level of novelty. And it enabled us to look at in a finer grained detail what specific scientific skills they were applying rather than background psychological knowledge. And I'll turn it back over to Tugce to speak from the instructor point of view.
Yeah. So when Josh and Adam approached me last year, it was, I think, right? It's been maybe a year now. This was the vision Josh had in his mind, probably. Adam and I were only supportive and, excited, but it was hard for us to imagine maybe. But with time, everything flew really excitingly. And I think really in a positive way, everyone was engaged among Frontiers of Science instructors. And I think we became so excited about the results of this study. It was like for us to have a peek to behind how these pedagogy research is done, and to be part of it was really thrilling for us. At this point, we are all eager to find out the results, which hopefully will be soon. And we are hoping with all the other instructors that what we are envisioning, that the connections we make with our students are indeed helping with their learning. So that will show the evidence for the value of student-instructor connection and quantify it. Quantification seems very important when you're actually communicating the value of that. And this could be showing us the importance of small class sizes and establishing connections early on, which could be maybe broadened to also other classes, not just in Frontiers of Science, but also in other classes which have, much larger classroom sizes. I think at the early ages, when we have the freshmen, our students always tell us, oh, you're the only instructor whom I can actually have a close contact, whom I can ask for a recommendation letter. I think for students, this is so important, and to quantify it and to show this will be so valuable. So I would like to thank for this to Solaire, to Adam for making this happen. And Adam has been a great support in all these steps. And of course, Josh, my partner in crime, we really had our fun. I hope you had the same experience. Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Absolutely. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much to Dr. Bilgin and to Josh there for an amazing presentation. I really like the way that you put all of that in context at the end there, help us understand another layer to the why of what we're doing. It's not just about getting really interesting research results, but the way that those results can inform the way that we think about the higher education context more broadly, and maybe help precipitate some change in the way that things really happen at a university here and beyond. So thanks very much for that again. And we have about 10 minutes left for some Q&A. I actually have a question that I would like to bring up to get us started. So we have all of our panelists back on camera. For Dr. Garbers and Dr. Russell, you mentioned this idea that part of doing SoTL research and learning analytics in particular is about understanding and responding to students' evolving needs and contexts. So I'm curious about how you reconcile that the need to respond accordingly as students and culture and technology changes with the idea that there may be certain core, elements of rigor or non-negotiables that you might insist on. So how do you reconcile that tension, or do you see that as a sort of false choice?
Well, I see it as a little bit of a false choice, right? So there's that really wonderful podcast that the CTL does, which is called Dead Ideas in Teaching and Learning, that last season really sort of talked about some of our own myths around rigor. Specifically in the field of public health, there's been a major change happening over the last few years. The number of undergraduate programs offering undergraduate degrees in public health has skyrocketed. So we have more and more students coming into our program with sort of foundational coursework on public health, at the same time that we are becoming increasingly an anti-racist institution, really looking at some of the gatekeeping practices that have been happening in the admissions process and becoming more inclusive and holistic in our admissions processes. And as a result, what it's meant is that everybody is encountering this information from multiple perspectives. And so what it really requires us to do is to ensure that no matter how people are encountering the information or what toolkit they're coming to the course with, that all of these perspectives enrich the experience, thus contributing, I think, to rigor. But it does require us to recognize that there are multiple pathways through which folks get to the same outcomes. And learning analytics can help us recognize, quantify some of these different pathways and how people learn. And that's really been the sort of focus on our work in the last couple of years.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. So I want to take that same question and alter it a little bit and pose it to Josh, because we have this idea of that students are always evolving and needs are changing, and the ways that people operate are changing because of changes in technology and culture. And so no problem in the SoTL research world can ever really be considered solved, because technology is going to change, culture is going to change, and students are going to change, and we'll have to go about addressing those questions anew every time. But at the same time, it seems to me that cognitive psychology is really about the pursuit of these fundamental insights about the way that human thinking works. And we imagine that those principles of human cognition aren't changing with technology and culture. So can you tell us a little bit about the way that this sort of applied learning sciences perspective that you and Tugce engaged in can maybe reconcile between this idea of, students and technology and culture are always changing, but at the same time, we're trying to, elucidate these fundamental principles about human cognition?
Sure. It's a big question. So, I don't know that I'll be able to answer it entirely, but my best shot is for a time, right? So, we are lucky to be at some moment in history, and that moment in history is lucky to have some culture, and that culture is developing. And what we might be able to do, sort of like riding the elephant of time, might be to hold that still long enough to be able to guide the reins a little bit easier, a little bit better for everybody involved than we might not otherwise be able to. It's why my work is really focused on quantifying and watching that change process over time in a very micro level environment, so we can understand enough of the micro level environment right now. And I think learning analytics takes largely the same perspective, from my understanding, to be able to then build on that and continuously build on that, improve on that, develop that as we go, despite the kind of grander change that's happening on the ground underneath.
Thanks, I appreciate that. And of course, I asked you a deep question because you're a deep person, so I knew you'd be up to the challenge. I think maybe we'll close out with one last question that everyone can respond to. So as I mentioned earlier, Solaire is in large part about collaborations, about building a community of people across this university who are interested in the science of learning in all of its different manifestations. So maybe you can each tell us a little bit about, or a couple of you, one from each panel, can tell us a little bit about what you've learned about your particular collaboration, about what are the keys to success in working in not just an interdisciplinary capacity, but one in which the collaborators have very different roles at the university. Maybe we'll start with Roxanne. That'd be great.
Well, before I say a key to success, I will say something that I learned, which I really appreciate, and that I think overlaps with the goals for Solaire, which is working with Dr. Garbers was particularly interesting because of her disciplinary focus, because of her role in public health and work in program planning and research. She brought such a fresh perspective for me for how we could use this data for behavioral intervention, where I've always been looking at it for learning design and from a learning theory perspective. She really wanted us to help change student behavior. So that was exciting. And then from a perspective from how I've been able to bring what I learned from her encounter with the data back to the ATLG and back to our needs and what, like how frustrating the way we access the data is currently for learning analytics, I think is one of the best ways to inform going forward what we need if it's going to be, if there's going to be uptake for faculty.
Yeah, I would just like to say that this work absolutely couldn't happen without the both of us. And Roxanne's mentioning, like, when I found out all of the data that are sitting behind there, it really was an eye-opener, and this sort of collaboration of the two of us with the sort of keen design mind, along with sort of thinking about how the data can be used, is really, it's been a great synergy.
Tugce, can you tell us a little bit about your experience collaborating with Josh?
Sure. It was surprisingly very smooth. I think we have a good synergy between us, which, does not happen very often. So I don't want to kind of generalize and put it as a bar, as an expectation. But I think it helps, of course, when you're actually having a common understanding with your partner, which we have. And I think you also mentioned what are the keys to success, Adam, in your question. And I think one is obviously having a good communication with your partners, being open to each other, being supportive to each other, which we have. But the other one is also being flexible, because as we work with students doing experiments, like, there are so many things. I think Josh is more at the verge generally. There are so many things that we cannot predict what will happen. So you need to be calm and try to find out solutions. I think Adam has been doing a great job to solve any issues we have on the way, because there is always something coming up, and then you have to be resourceful and creative to solve it. I mean, I have been doing molecular work, and molecules I thought were chaotic, but humans are much more chaotic. So I think the key is like a combination of all these things. And I would say, just as a nod to the gist of our project, connections, having, establishing good connections between all the collaborators is the key.
Thank you so much. That's such a wonderful note to end on, and that is all the time we have. You all probably noticed that I tried to call them by Dr. So-and-so, but ultimately I reverted to first names, and that's just because I've gotten to know all four of them, really well working on these projects, and we're definitely on a first name basis. So thank you all so much, for doing this work with Solaire and for taking part in this panel today. Sorry that we did not really get to the Q&A much, from the audience, but we can always continue these conversations elsewhere, and I hope that we'll do all that soon. So thank you all again to our panelists and to all of our attendees.